Benjamin Franklin once said that only two things are certain in life: death and taxes. We talk happily about taxes, but we invent euphemisms to avoid discussing our passing or our moving on. World-renowned forensic anthropologist, researcher and author Professor Dame Sue Black does speak of death. In her career, much of her work has been with the dead. She has made significant contributions to the fields of forensic science, particularly in the area of human identification. Her work has been instrumental in solving numerous criminal cases and bringing certainty to the families of missing persons. In the recent Royal Institution Christmas lectures, she talked about our own mortality and why death has become taboo. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Sue Black. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you.
At one time in my career, after I was Defence Secretary, I was involved on a committee that oversaw the digging up of the dead in a place called Srebrenica, which was a massacre in the former Yugoslavia. And we took DNA samples from, I think, about 100,000 people to try to identify possibly about 8,000 who'd been murdered at that place, matching DNA. Is that your sort of work, or has your work moved on from that?
Unfortunately, that's still an important part of the work that we do. So that we either are working in the criminal sphere, so we're looking at identification of individuals, perhaps as a result of a single crime. And it's often people who are not found where you expect them to die. So most of us expect to die at home or in a hospital, and our identity isn't in question. So it's where a body is found and we don't initially know who they might be. It might be that we have a mass fatality event. And so, for example, in an explosion or in a fire, bodies may be disrupted. And so, again, identification becomes important there, and in the war crime scenarios that you suggested. So sometimes it's very much humanitarian, but sometimes it is actually for the purposes of the court, because somebody is being accused of a crime.
From what I recall, in these instances, and these go back obviously some decades, so things may have changed, a DNA match would be made, and then before any kind of announcement could be made, that would be compared with other evidence, for instance, the clothing or the jewellery that the deceased was wearing, as far as one knew at the time of the death, and other circumstantial evidence. This would still be part of the pattern, would it?
Yes, so we will do absolutely everything that we can to ensure that we have the right answer. Because if you have the wrong answer, then you don't impact on one family, you impact on two, because you've handed the wrong body back to the wrong family, and that's unthinkable. So whilst we think DNA is the solution for everything, it isn't always, because sometimes DNA can be through contamination. So simply picking up the DNA sample may mean that it's perhaps blood splatter from somewhere else. So we will go through, is it a male? Is it somebody of the right sort of age? Do we have fingerprints that we can still look at? Do we have dental records? Do we have medical records? And it's sometimes the accusation we're given where, why does it take so long? He had a lanyard round his neck. Well, at the end of the day, we have to prove that that person on the lanyard really is the person wearing it. Otherwise, we cause an awful lot of grief to families.
Siblings, I remember, was another area of difficulty because the DNA would be extremely close, wouldn't it?
Yes, and often for DNA in situations such as Srebrenica or any of the other war crimes investigations, what you're doing is you're comparing familial DNA. So it's not your own personal DNA.
No,
that's where we can get to the 1 in a billion scenario. But you're saying here is a mother or a father, and that doesn't tell you which of the children it is. It tells you it's just one of their children. And one of the mass graves that we had in Kosovo, for example, it was 11 members of the same family, and 8 of them were children. And so even though the DNA tells you they're the child, it doesn't tell you which child it is. And that's really important, because if you are going to accuse somebody of a war crime, if everybody is of combatant age, then there is an argument that says it's a fair death. But when the individuals we were looking at were as young as 2 or 4, then you have evidence that says this is not a normal war situation, this is a war crime.
What advances do you feel that you and I'm sure your teams have been making? What have been new techniques that you've been pioneering?
I think, there's no doubt that DNA changed the entire world of forensic investigations in the 1980s. No doubt about it whatsoever. But we've become so smart at that now we're picking up such minuscule areas of DNA that contamination and cross-contamination has become a problem. So we've become a little bit too clever in some ways. For us, the work that we've been doing is we've been looking at identification from different parts of the body. So some of the crimes that I work on are really the worst in society, which is the identification of children in relation to sexual abuse. And often the perpetrator will have parts of their anatomy in the image. And most frequently, it's the back of the hand. So there's a huge amount of information about you on the back of your hand. So I guarantee the pattern of veins on the back of your right hand will be different to your left. I guarantee that the pattern of skin creases across your knuckles will be different across every finger and different in identical twins.
This is almost like fingerprinting.
Almost. And it's using anatomy, which is what's really interesting. The most ancient of sciences, things that we've known about for centuries, now just applying them into the real world that says, how can we use this information to help?
And has that sort of information achieved convictions?
Oh, yes. So about 82% of the cases that we take on have resulted in a change of plea. And that's from either no comment or not guilty to an admission. And that's really important because it does a couple of things. It saves a tremendous amount of money in the courtroom. But what it also does is for those young people who have been involved in that abuse, they now are not going into court. They're not being questioned in the same way. And that's a hugely important step forward, I think, for them in terms of a protection. And we work for both the prosecution and the defence because it's really important. You are innocent until you're proven guilty. And so science must be able to work across both sides of the legal system.
A lot of people might wonder why you would go into such a gruesome business. But I wonder whether part of the answer is that you could foresee the satisfaction of contributing to justice.
That's really important. I'm an anatomist from day one. That's where my heart genuinely lies, is the human body is the most amazing mechanism. It really is. And it tells us so much about ourselves. Being able to translate that into real world problems where you can help to solve either issues of justice or issues of identification that allows somebody to have that family member return to them is incredibly important. People who have a missing family member often say their life goes into a stutter and they just can't move on until they know. And they often live with that really cruel thing of false hope. And false hope is incredibly cruel. So when we come back and say, I'm sorry it is your son, your mother, it's very painful, but it's the start in some ways of that healing process. So it's a kindness as well.
Most of us never see a dead body. You see lots, I'm afraid to say. But that has helped, I think you argue, to make death into a taboo subject, something that we don't wish to confront. Tell me a bit about how you confront your own mortality.
Oh, I am very, very pragmatic about this. So I know I'm going to die. Now, I don't want to die anytime soon. I'd quite like it to be a long time in the future. But I know it's going to happen. And so therefore you can't pretend that it's not going to, and you have to be realistic about it. My grandmother grew up on the west coast of Scotland, and she believed that death walked alongside you every day of your life. And at some point or other, your paths would cross, and that would happen either in the next 10 minutes or in the next 50 years. And her rationale was, if death is going to be beside you every step of the way, wouldn't it be better if they were a friend than an enemy? And because she grew up in the 1800s, it would have been totally improper for her to have a friend who was a man. And so death in our family has always been a woman. It's always been feminine. It's always been female. And somehow that takes away some of that aggression that we associate with death, which has very much been fed from our media and from novels, films, all of these sorts of things give you this concept that death is something to be afraid of. Now, I don't want to spend my entire life being afraid of something. I'd rather embrace it. So I know exactly if I get my way, what my death will look like and what my life beyond my death will look like.
Do you think there's a certain decadence then in our society today that we find so many euphemisms to avoid talking about death, frankly?
I think we've fallen out of love with death. If you go back to the Victorians, they were very much in love with a good death. A good death and a good funeral was something to be celebrated. It was a pomp and it was a ceremony. And if you go back into rural communities, when Granny died, she was laid out in her coffin in the front room and everybody would come around and they would talk about her and they would tell the stories. And we've lost that intimate connection with death. As death became medicalised, it's been removed from us in many ways. Most people will die in a hospital or in a hospice in a controlled environment, and suddenly the body's whisked away as if it's something that is just unclean and needs to be removed. And in this country, most frequently, the lid goes on the coffin and it gets screwed down and you never see that person again. And being able to see somebody in death is a really important point of the healing and the grieving process, I think. I just think we've let it go too far.
To pick up your word medicalised, it's very much on people's lips this morning, because one of the things that's being said is that part of the problem of the National Health Service is that we can allow people to live for very long periods of time when their quality of life has gone. Do you have a position on that?
So I do. I mean, if I'm going to get an extra 10 years in my life, I wanted it when I was 20. I don't want it when I'm 80 because of all of the consistent problems that are likely to come with that. So I'm very comfortable. I don't go to my GP. In fact, the last time I went to my GP for any reason was when I was pregnant with my last daughter, and she's 25. So I'll go if I need to go, but I'm very fortunate I haven't needed to. And I'm also very pragmatic that when it is my fate and my time, then I would like to be able to move on then and not become dependent on an NHS system, on the drugs that would keep me alive. I want to experience death because I'm only going to do it once. I'm not going to do it twice. And I want to know what it feels like. I want to know what it sounds like, what it tastes like, what it looks like. It's the last great adventure.
Marvellously said. And I think I say hear, hear to that. Many thanks indeed to Dame Sue Black.